Japanese were terrified by America's island-hopping strategy. They'll never make it past the outer ring. The Americans don't have the will to sacrifice what's necessary. Admiral, with respect, they don't need the will to sacrifice, they have the capacity to overwhelm. The room fell silent in the Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters in Tokyo. It was March 15, 1943, and Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku sat at the head of a polished conference table, maps of the Pacific spread before him like a patient's vital signs before a surgeon who had just realized the diagnosis was terminal. Commander Watanabe Koji, the intelligence officer who had just spoken, watched as the Admiral's jaw tightened. Around them, 6 other officers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The maps told a story that most men in that room refused to read. Blue marks indicated American positions. Red marks showed Japanese strongholds across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean. But it was the pattern of blue marks that made Watanabe's stomach turn. They weren't following the expected path. The Americans weren't attacking every island. They were leaping forward, moving in ways that defied conventional military wisdom. "Look at this," Yamamoto said, tapping Guadalcanal on the map. "We lost 31,000 men there, 31,000, and for what? So they could take one island." He looked up, his eyes hard. "At that rate, they'll need 100 years to reach Tokyo. The mathematics are simple, gentlemen. We have over 4,000 islands in the Pacific. They cannot possibly take them all." Captain Nakamura Hiroshi, one of the Navy's most decorated combat officers, nodded emphatically. "The Americans lack discipline," he said. "They're soft. They won't sustain these casualties for long. At Tarawa, they lost 1,000 Marines in 72 hours. Their newspapers are already calling it a massacre." But Watanabe couldn't shake what he'd seen in the intelligence reports. The Americans weren't behaving like an army that was breaking. They were behaving like an army that was learning. "Admiral," he said carefully, "I must draw your attention to their production figures. In January alone, American shipyards produced—" "I don't want to hear about their production," Yamamoto interrupted, though his voice was weary rather than angry. "I've known about their industrial capacity since I studied at Harvard. What I'm telling you is that production means nothing if they lack the will to use it." What none of them knew, what they couldn't have known as they studied those maps in that warm Tokyo afternoon, was that the Americans had already abandoned the strategy the Japanese were defending against. The island-hopping campaign that would terrify Japan into surrender wasn't about taking every island. It was about taking the right islands and letting the others die on the vine. Within 18 months, Japanese soldiers would be trapped on fortified islands with no hope of supply, no hope of reinforcement, watching American ships pass them by as if they didn't exist. The humiliation would be worse than death. The mathematics that seemed so certain in that conference room would be inverted. The casualty ratios would shift. And the laughter, particularly Captain Nakamura's confident laughter, would become history's most expensive miscalculation, measured in the lives of over 2 million Japanese soldiers who would die not in glorious battle, but from starvation, disease, and abandonment on bypassed islands. But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 6 months earlier, in September 1942, when the seeds of this strategy were first planted. The day everything changed, the conference room at Pearl Harbor smelled of coffee, cigarette smoke, and the salt air that blew through the open windows. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood at a large table, studying the same Pacific maps that his Japanese counterparts would examine 6 months later. But Nimitz was seeing something different. "We can't do it," he said quietly. "Not the conventional way." General Douglas MacArthur, who had flown in from Australia for this meeting, looked up sharply. "What exactly can't we do, Admiral?" "Win," Nimitz replied. "Not in any reasonable time frame. Look at the numbers." He picked up a pointer and began tapping islands. "Rabaul, Truk, the Marianas, the Philippines. If we assault every fortified position between here and Tokyo, we'll need 10 years and 1 million casualties, maybe more." Colonel Raymond Murray, a Marine Corps planner, stepped forward. He was younger than most men in the room, just 38, but he'd been studying Japanese defensive doctrine since before the war. "Sir, what if we didn't attack every fortified position?" The room went quiet. Someone coughed. "Explain," Nimitz said. Murray moved to the map. "The Japanese have done exactly what we would have done. They've fortified strategic islands all across the Pacific. But here's the thing, their strategy depends on us attacking those fortifications. What if we simply didn't?" "You're suggesting we leave Japanese forces in our rear?" MacArthur's voice carried an edge of disbelief. "I'm suggesting we make them irrelevant, sir." Murray's finger traced a path across the map, skipping over heavily fortified islands and touching lightly defended ones. We take islands with airfields or potential airfields. We build up overwhelming air superiority. Then we use that air superiority to isolate the fortified islands, cut off their supply. Make them into prisons instead of fortresses. An intelligence officer named Robert Sherwood spoke up. He'd been analyzing Japanese logistics for months. The colonel has a point. The Japanese supply line is already stretched thin. They're moving supplies by submarine to many of their garrisons. If we control the air and sea around an island, that garrison becomes completely isolated. They'll starve, someone said. Yes, Murray replied simply. Nimitz studied the map for a long moment. The room waited. Finally, he spoke. The Japanese expect us to behave like honorable warriors, to meet them in battle at every fortification, to grind ourselves to pieces against their prepared positions. He looked up. What if we behaved like businessmen instead? What if we calculated the most efficient path to Tokyo and simply took it, ignoring everything that didn't serve that goal? It's ruthless, MacArthur observed. It's practical, Nimitz countered. And it will save American lives. Every week we shorten this war is thousands of our boys who come home instead of dying on some godforsaken island that doesn't matter strategically. The decision was made in that room, though it would take months to fully implement and years to execute. The United States would not fight the war Japan expected. They would fight the war America was best equipped to win, a war of industrial production, logistical superiority, and calculated efficiency. If you're enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to hear more stories like this. The machine awakens *** 3,000 miles away, in a factory outside Detroit, Michigan. A transformation was underway that would prove more devastating to Japan than any battle. Margaret Chen had worked as a seamstress before the war. Now she operated a rivet gun on the assembly line at the Willow Run bomber plant. Every 8 hours, her shift produced components for B-24 Liberator bombers. Every 63 minutes, a completed bomber rolled off the final assembly line. "My husband's out there," she said during her lunch break, sitting with 3 other women in the massive cafeteria. "Somewhere in the Pacific. Every plane I help build might be the one that covers him, keeps him safe." Helen Rodriguez, who operated the welding station next to Margaret's, nodded. "My brother's a Marine. He was at Guadalcanal." She didn't need to say more. Everyone knew what Guadalcanal had cost. They returned to the line. The rhythm was hypnotic, pneumatic tools hissing, metal clashing, the rumble of completed aircraft moving down the assembly line. By the end of their shift, Margaret's station alone had placed 1,247 rivets. Multiplied across all shifts, across all stations, the numbers became staggering. The Willow Run plant produced 1 B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. That was 380 bombers per month from a single factory. Japan's entire aircraft industry produced 765 aircraft per month across all factories, all types, fighters, bombers, trainers, everything. One American factory was producing half as many heavy bombers as Japan's entire aviation industry produced total aircraft. And Willow Run was just one factory. At the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, Henry Kaiser had revolutionized ship production using assembly line techniques learned from automobile manufacturing. Before the war, building a Liberty ship, a basic cargo vessel, took 230 days. Kaiser's yards had reduced that to 42 days, then 30 days. His workers were now building complete ships in 14 days. Robert Peary, a welder who had previously worked in the automotive industry, remembered the day they broke the record. "We built the SS Robert E. Peary in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes, he recalled. "Start to finish. I watched them christen her and sail her out. 4.5 days from laying the keel to sailing away. The Japanese didn't build ships that fast in their dreams." The waste was staggering waste that would have seemed criminal to Japanese military planners operating under desperate scarcity. The Willow Run cafeteria threw away more aluminum scraps in a single day than some Japanese island garrisons received in a month. Workers discarded defective rivets by the pound. Inspectors rejected entire aircraft sections for minor flaws and scrapped them. "We threw away more metal in testing than the Japanese used in production," Margaret Chen remembered. But that was the point. We could afford to be wasteful because we weren't wasteful, we were thorough. Every rivet that didn't meet spec got tossed. Every weld that looked questionable got redone. We weren't trying to make do with what we had. We were trying to make things perfect because we had enough to do it right. Back in Tokyo, Commander Watanabe was seeing the production figures in intelligence reports, but he couldn't make his superiors understand what they meant. He tried to explain it to Admiral Yamamoto in March 1943. "Sir, the Americans produced 29 aircraft carriers in 1942, not fleet carriers, escort carriers mostly, but still, 29 carriers in 1 year. We have 8 operational carriers in our entire Navy." Yamamoto had been to America. He understood their industrial capacity better than most. "I know, Commander, I've always known. I told the Emperor we could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year. After that, their production would overwhelm us. But knowing they can produce ships doesn't mean they can sustain the casualties needed to use them. Sir, what if they've found a way to use their production advantage without taking casualties?" That was the question Yamamoto couldn't answer. The Americans were changing the rules of engagement in ways that Japanese military doctrine hadn't prepared for. The first leap asterisk November 20, 1943. The Gilbert Islands, Makin Atoll. Sergeant Thomas Bradley of the 27th Infantry Division had never seen anything like the bombardment that preceded their landing. For 3 days, American battleships and cruisers had pounded the tiny island. Carrier aircraft had made over 200 strikes. The island was less than 2 miles long. "They're killing the whole damn island," someone joked nervously. The landing itself was almost anticlimactic. The Japanese garrison, dazed and depleted by the bombardment, put up scattered resistance. The island fell in 4 days with 66 American dead and 152 wounded. Over 300 Japanese defenders were killed. Only 1 prisoner was taken alive. 200 miles away, at Tarawa, the story was different. The Marines faced prepared defenses and suffered over 1,000 casualties in 72 hours of brutal fighting. But even there, the mathematics were clear. 1,696 American casualties to eliminate an entire Japanese garrison of 4,690 men. But the real story wasn't at Tarawa or Makin. It was at the islands the Americans didn't attack. Mili Atoll sat 250 miles southeast of Tarawa. The Japanese had 2,500 troops garrisoned there, with coastal guns, prepared defenses, and months of supplies. They waited for the American assault. It never came. American carrier aircraft struck the airfield at Mili on November 19, destroying most of the Japanese planes on the ground. Then the American fleet sailed past, heading for Tarawa and Makin. The garrison at Mili watched them go. Lieutenant Tanaka Yashiro was the intelligence officer at Mili. He sent an urgent message to headquarters in Truk. "American fleet bypassed our position, proceeding west. Request instructions." The reply came back. "Maintain defensive positions. Resupply will arrive within 2 weeks." The resupply never came. Mili Atoll had just become a prison with 2,500 inmates and no jailer. The pattern emerges asterisk by January 1944. Commander Watanabe could see the pattern clearly. He laid it out in a briefing to the Naval General Staff. "Gentlemen, the Americans attacked Tarawa and Makin. They did not attack Mili, Jaluit, Malolap, or Wat. Each of those atolls has between 2,000 and 3,000 troops. Combined, we have over 10,000 men garrisoned in the Marshall Islands that the Americans simply ignored." "Because they're cowards," Captain Nakamura interrupted. "They take the easy targets." "They took Tarawa," Watanabe replied quietly. "Tarawa was anything but easy. They suffered significant casualties. No, they're not avoiding difficult targets. They're avoiding unnecessary targets." He pointed to the map. "Every island they've attacked either had an airfield or could support an airfield. Every island they've bypassed was either too small for an airfield or too heavily defended to be worth the cost when nearby alternatives existed. They're not island hopping, they're airfield hopping." Admiral Koga Mainichi, who had replaced Yamamoto after his death in April 1943, leaned forward. "To what end?" "To isolate our forward bases without fighting for them. Look at Rabaul. We have over 90,000 troops there. It's one of our strongest positions in the Pacific. The Americans haven't attacked it. They've attacked islands around it, New Georgia, Bougainville, Green Island. They're building airfields on these islands and using them to bomb Rabaul daily. Our garrison there is combat ineffective without the Americans ever landing a single soldier on the island." The room was silent. Then Nakamura spoke. "So they're cowards who won't fight us directly." "No," Watanabe said, and his voice carried a weight that made even Nakamura pause. "They're engineers solving a problem efficiently. They've calculated that building an airfield takes less time and fewer casualties than assaulting a fortress. So they build airfields instead of assaulting fortresses, and then they use those airfields to make the fortresses irrelevant." "It's not honorable," someone muttered. "It's not supposed to be honorable," Watanabe replied. "It's supposed to be effective, and it is." The leap across the Pacific February 17, 1944. The Marshall Islands, Eniwetok Atoll. The American invasion force arrived before dawn. Rear Admiral Harry Hill watched from his command ship as the bombardment began. This time there would be no prolonged shelling. The island had to be taken quickly. "Why the rush, sir?" a young ensign asked. "Because Truk is 400 miles away," Hill replied. "The Japanese fleet base. If we take Eniwetok, we control the northwestern Marshalls. But if we take too long, the Japanese fleet might sortie from Truk and catch us exposed." "So we hit them first, sir?" Hill smiled. "Exactly." Task Force 58, the fast carrier task force, had already departed for Truk. While Marines and Army troops landed at Eniwetok, carrier aircraft struck Truk in a devastating raid. Over 250 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. 45 ships were sunk. The most powerful Japanese naval base in the Central Pacific was gutted in 2 days of attacks, and the Americans never landed a single soldier there. Chief Petty Officer Yamada Kenji was at Truk during the raid. He watched from a shelter as American dive bombers fell from the sky like hawks, their bombs destroying ships, warehouses, fuel dumps, and aircraft. The raid lasted 6 hours. By the time it ended, Truk had ceased to function as an effective naval base. "They didn't even bother to invade us," Yamada said to a fellow sailor. "They just broke us and left us here." That was the pattern now. The Americans would identify a Japanese strongpoint. Then they would calculate whether taking it was worth the cost. If it was strategically necessary, they would take it with overwhelming force. If it wasn't necessary, they would isolate it and move on. The bypassed garrisons became known as the living dead. Soldiers trapped on islands with no supply, no reinforcement, no hope of relief, and no enemy to fight. They could only watch as American ships and aircraft passed by, heading for targets closer to Japan. The voice from the fortress, April 1944. Truk Lagoon. Commander Watanabe was sent to Truk to assess the damage and report back to headquarters. What he found was a base that had effectively ceased to exist as a combat asset. The harbor was filled with sunken ships. The airfield was cratered. The warehouses were destroyed. Over 4,000 men had been killed in the raids, but worst of all were the men who survived. They had fuel for perhaps 3 more months, food for 5 months if they rationed strictly. Medical supplies were depleted. There were no spare parts for the remaining aircraft, no ammunition for the anti-aircraft guns. "When is the relief convoy coming?" an army captain asked Watanabe. "There is no relief convoy," Watanabe replied. "Every convoy we send toward Truk is attacked by submarines or aircraft. The Americans control the sea and air between here and Japan. We can't resupply you. So we wait here for what? For them to come back and finish us." "They won't come back," Watanabe said quietly. "You're no longer strategically important. They've moved on." The captain stared at him. "You mean we're just abandoned?" "I mean you've been bypassed. The Americans have already moved 1,000 miles closer to Japan. Truk no longer matters to their plans." Watanabe returned to Tokyo and reported directly to Admiral Koga. "Sir, we have over 100,000 troops stranded on bypassed islands. Truk, Rabaul, Kavieng, the atolls in the Marshalls. They have limited supplies and no hope of resupply. The Americans don't even bother to attack them anymore." Koga's face was grave. "What do you recommend?" "I recommend we face the reality that we cannot defend every position. We should withdraw these troops while we still can, consolidate our forces, and prepare a defense in depth." "Withdraw?" Captain Nakamura had been listening. "Fall back. That's exactly what the Americans want. They want us to abandon our forward positions." "Our forward positions have already been abandoned," Watanabe replied. "By us when we stopped supplying them. The men are still there, but they're no longer functional military units. They're just prisoners who haven't been captured yet." The battle that wasn't June 15, 1944. Saipan. This time there would be no bypassing. Saipan was too important. It was close enough to Japan for B-29 bombers to reach the home islands. The Americans needed it, and the Japanese knew they couldn't afford to lose it. The naval battle of the Philippine Sea began on June 19. It would later be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese carrier aircraft faced American fighters in the largest carrier battle of the war. Lieutenant Commander John "Jimmy" Thatch watched from the deck of USS Lexington as the radar picked up the incoming Japanese aircraft. "Here they come," he said. "Launch all fighters." What followed was systematic annihilation. American pilots, flying superior aircraft and guided by radar, tore through the Japanese formations. Of 373 Japanese carrier aircraft that attacked, 330 were shot down. The Americans lost 30 aircraft. Seaman First Class Tanaka Hiroshi watched from the carrier Teiho as American torpedo bombers approached. "I saw our fighters trying to intercept them," he recalled years later. "But the American fighters were protecting their bombers. Our planes couldn't get through. Then I saw the torpedo tracks in the water, 3 of them headed right for us. I heard the first explosion, then the second. The third missed, but 2 were enough." Teiho sank later that day. Shikaku, another carrier, was also sunk. A third carrier, Hio, went down on June 20. The Japanese fleet limped away, having lost 3 carriers, 395 carrier aircraft, and 445 aircrew. They had sunk no American ships. On Saipan itself, the ground battle was brutal. The Japanese garrison fought with desperate courage. Of the 31,000 Japanese troops on the island, 30,000 died. The Americans suffered 3,400 killed and 10,000 wounded. But when it was over, the Americans had their bomber base. By November, B-29 superfortresses were flying from Saipan to bomb Tokyo. The unsinkable aircraft carrier that the Americans had created was launching raids on the Japanese homeland. The Mathematics of Despair *, August 1944. Tokyo. Commander Watanabe prepared his final comprehensive report on the American strategy. The numbers were devastating. American production in 1944, 74,000 combat aircraft. Japanese production, 24,000. American shipyard production in 1944, 50 aircraft carriers all types, 2,654 landing craft, 8 battleships, 27 cruisers, 76 destroyers, 78 submarines. Japanese production, 4 carriers, 1 battleship, 6 cruisers, 31 destroyers, 37 submarines. American casualties in the island-hopping campaign from November 1943 to August 1944, approximately 29,000 killed and wounded. Japanese casualties in the same period, over 180,000 killed, with an additional 125,000 troops stranded on bypassed islands. The kill ratios in naval aviation had shifted dramatically. At Coral Sea in 1942, Japanese and American aircraft losses were roughly equal. By the Philippine Sea in 1944, the Japanese were losing 11 aircraft for every American plane shot down. "How did this happen?" Admiral Koga asked, reading the report. "They outproduced us, outtrained us, and outthought us," Watanabe replied. "Our pilots fly until they die. Theirs rotate home after a combat tour and become instructors. Our factories struggle to build aircraft with limited materials. Theirs produce aircraft so fast they throw away defective parts rather than trying to salvage them. Our strategy assumed they would fight us island by island. Instead, they fought us where it suited them and ignored us where it didn't. And Captain Nakamura's confidence that they lacked the will to sustain casualties." Watanabe hesitated. Nakamura had died 3 months earlier, shot down during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. His aircraft had been hit by an American F-6F Hellcat. The engagement lasted 43 seconds from first contact to Nakamura's death. "Captain Nakamura was wrong," Watanabe said simply. "They didn't need the will to sustain casualties because they found a way to minimize casualties while maximizing effectiveness. They turned war into engineering, and we brought swords to a machine shop." The final island *, February 19, 1945. Iwo Jima. This island couldn't be bypassed. It was too close to Japan, too useful for emergency bomber landings and fighter escorts. The Japanese knew it, too. They had 21,000 troops fortified in an underground fortress that had taken 8 months to build. The battle lasted 36 days. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, 20,703 died. The Americans suffered 6,821 killed and 19,217 wounded, the highest casualty rate of any Pacific battle. But by March 26, the island was secured. By April, damaged B-29s were making emergency landings there, saving the lives of over 2,400 American airmen who would have died in ocean ditches if Iwo Jima hadn't been available. Sergeant Bradley, who had landed at Macon 16 months earlier, was at Iwo Jima. "It was hell," he said. "Absolute hell, but it was the only time in the whole campaign where we couldn't bypass. Every other island we had a choice. This one we needed." The living and the dead * September 1945. Truk Lagoon. The war was over. Commander Watanabe was part of the delegation that went to Truk to accept the surrender of the bypassed garrison. What he found shocked even him. The garrison had been cut off for 18 months. Of the 22,000 troops who had been at Truk when the war ended, over 4,000 had died of starvation and disease. The survivors were emaciated, sick, and psychologically broken. "Why didn't you attack us?" a Japanese army colonel asked Watanabe. "Why leave us here to die slowly?" "Because attacking you would have cost American lives," Watanabe replied. "And you couldn't threaten them here. They made you irrelevant instead of making you dead." At Rabaul, 90,000 Japanese troops surrendered. They had been bypassed in January 1944. For 20 months, they had sat on their fortified island while the war moved past them. They had grown their own food, suffered their own diseases, and waited for an attack that never came. The total number of Japanese troops stranded on bypassed islands when the war ended, over 250,000 men. Many had been cut off for 2 years or more. They had been tactically defeated without ever being attacked, simply by being made irrelevant. The price of mathematics *, Sergeant Thomas Bradley returned home to Iowa in October 1945. He had survived the entire island-hopping campaign from Macon to Okinawa. When people asked him about the war, he found it hard to explain what the strategy had been like to experience. "People think we fought our way across the Pacific island by island," he said. "That's not what happened. We fought when we had to and went around when we could. Every island we didn't attack was American lives saved. Every Japanese garrison we bypassed was one less battle we had to fight." "But what about the Japanese soldiers on those islands?" someone asked. "What about them? They chose to fight for an empire that invaded its neighbors. When that empire couldn't supply them anymore, they got what they signed up for, a war, just not the glorious battle they expected." Margaret Chen, who had built bomber components at Willow Run, returned to civilian life with a different perspective. "People talk about the atomic bombs ending the war, but the war was already over before those bombs fell. The island-hopping campaign had cut Japan off from its empire. No oil, no rubber, no food imports. The Americans were bombing Japanese cities at will. Japan couldn't win. They just hadn't accepted it yet." She paused. "Every rivet I placed, every plane we built, that was part of it. Not because we were better fighters, but because we were better builders. We won because we could afford to waste materials on quality control. We won because our workers were volunteers who wanted to win, not slaves forced to work. That made all the difference." Chief Petty Officer Yamada Kenji survived the war at Truk. He was repatriated to Japan in early 1946, weighing 93 pounds. "We expected them to invade us," he said in an interview decades later. "We expected a final, glorious battle. Instead, they just forgot about us. They moved on. That was more demoralizing than any battle could have been, to be deemed not worth fighting, not worth even attacking, just irrelevant." The lesson that echoes Commander Watanabe spent the post-war years teaching at Japan's National Defense Academy. He would often use the island-hopping campaign as a case study in strategic miscalculation. "We made 3 critical errors," he would tell his students. "First, we assumed the Americans would fight our kind of war honorable, direct, island by island. They didn't. They fought their kind of war efficient, calculated, economically driven. Second, we underestimated their industrial capacity. We saw the numbers, but we didn't believe them. We thought their democracy made them weak, their civilian culture made them soft. Instead, their democracy gave them motivated workers, and their civilian culture gave them industrial expertise. Third, and most critically, we confused tactical victories with strategic success. We won battles. We killed more of them than they killed of us in the early battles, but they could afford those losses. We couldn't. Every ship we sank, they built 3 more. Every aircraft we shot down, they replaced with 5. Every soldier they lost was mourned and replaced. Every soldier we lost was irreplaceable." He would pause, looking at the young officers before him. "The island-hopping campaign was brilliantly simple. Take what you need. Bypass what you don't. Use industrial superiority to support tactical flexibility. Never fight on the enemy's terms when you can dictate your own." But the deeper lesson is this: never dismiss a democracy as weak because it prefers peace. Never underestimate free people's capacity to produce when threatened. And never, ever assume that your enemy will fight the war you prepare for. The Americans didn't fight our war. They fought their war, and we lost because we couldn't adapt to that reality. Now, back to where we started, that conference room in Tokyo, March 1943. Admiral Yamamoto had laughed that day when Commander Watanabe suggested the Americans might be changing the nature of Pacific warfare. Captain Nakamura had been openly dismissive. The mathematics had seemed so clear, so undeniable. By August 1945, Yamamoto was dead, killed by American fighters in April 1943. Nakamura was dead, shot down in the Philippine Sea. The mathematics had indeed been undeniable, just not in the way they had calculated. The Americans had produced 300,000 military aircraft during the war. Japan produced 76,000. The Americans built 175 aircraft carriers. Japan built 25. The United States lost 407,000 military personnel in the entire war, across all theaters. Japan lost over 2.1 million in the Pacific alone. But the truly devastating number was this. Of Japan's 2.1 million military deaths, over 300,000 died on bypassed islands, not from American attacks, but from starvation, disease, and isolation. They died waiting for supplies that never came, reinforcements that never arrived, and attacks that never materialized. They died because they had become irrelevant to the American advance. The island-hopping strategy proved something that reverberates through history, that in modern warfare, economic power translates to military power. That industrial capacity determines strategic possibility. That democracies, when fully mobilized, can outproduce autocracies. That free workers build better weapons than slaves. That efficiency can be more devastating than ferocity. Admiral Yamamoto had known this before the war. He had studied in America. He had seen their factories, their highways, their culture of innovation and production. He had warned Japan's leaders that attacking America was madness. But once the decision was made, he served his country. And he died knowing that everything he had feared was coming true. The final lesson of the island-hopping campaign isn't about tactics or strategy. It's about the fundamental miscalculation that doomed Japan from the start. The belief that will and spirit could overcome industrial capacity, that Bushido could defeat assembly lines, that determination could trump production. It couldn't. It never could. The Americans didn't need to be better warriors. They just needed to be better engineers, better manufacturers, better logisticians. And they were. Overwhelmingly so. On March 15, 1943, in that Tokyo conference room, the Japanese officers had studied their maps and calculated their odds based on courage, spirit, and tactical skill. They should have been calculating based on steel production, shipyard capacity, and aircraft assembly rates. Those were the numbers that mattered. Those were the mathematics that determined victory. The terrified realization came not all at once, but gradually island by island, battle by battle, as Japanese officers understood that they weren't fighting an army. They were fighting a machine. An industrial, economic, logistical machine that could lose battles and still win the war, that could take casualties and still advance, that could bypass your strongest fortresses and make them prisons without firing a shot. That was what truly terrified them. Not American ferocity or courage, those qualities they understood and respected. What terrified them was American pragmatism, the cold calculation that said, "This island costs too much, we'll take that one instead." The ruthless efficiency that turned warfare into cost-benefit analysis. The industrial mindset that treated war like engineering problem to be solved efficiently rather than a test of honor to be won gloriously. Democracy had proven stronger than autocracy. Free labor had proven more productive than coerced labor, and calculated efficiency had proven more devastating than suicidal courage. Those lessons remain true today. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.